Good day, everybody, and thank you for joining us, and a heartiest warm welcome to you all to another consultation by the Asian Development Bank. This is part of the stakeholder engagement that supports the Safeguard Policy Review and Update process. A very happy new year to you all, and so nice to see so many colleagues joining us again in the new year. For those of you joining us for the first time in the new year and for this first Cultural Heritage consultation session, a very warm welcome and a very good day to you all. My name is Azim Manji, and I am your consultation moderator for this session. This is, as I mentioned, the first consultation on cultural heritage, and as I mentioned, the first session of the new year. We hope to be joined by a few more participants, but just let me give you a brief overview of who's joining us today for this series. We have 83 registered participants for this morning's consultation. 68 of those are from outside the ADB. Of these, 34 are from government executing agencies and implementing agencies. 34 are from NGOs, academic institutes, independent researchers, private sector, and consulting groups. Today, we're joined mostly from Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. By country breakdown, we have representation this morning from the Philippines, Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Laos PDR, Vietnam, Mongolia, the People's Republic of China, and Fiji. We also have participants from South Asian countries, including Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and India. We're also joined this morning by participants from the United States, Canada, Afghanistan, Japan, and Central and West Asian countries, including Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. And I believe we will shortly be joined by other indigenous peoples groups and independent contractors. I noticed that some of you also attended our previous consultations, while there are also new participants here that I wish to recognize your individual as well as collective knowledge, expertise, and engagement in various subtopics of today's cultural heritage consultation. Today, the ADB will present its study that compares ADB's policy on cultural heritage with and from the key authors of the study. From the presentation, we are hoping participants like yourselves will share some insights on potential gaps of the provisions and implementation of the policy and propose recommendations to ensure the strengthening, especially the future strengthening of this policy. Comments received from this consultation and thereafter, of course, will be recorded as you've seen, and will be duly noted and considered in the final study report. These will inform the revisions of ADB's standards on cultural heritage. Before we start, and before I call upon our speakers, just a few gentle reminders. Please join us from a quiet, distraction-free area. And please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking, as well as, of course, your video. This will help to minimize the background noise and allow others to hear the speakers making the presentations and others making their contributions at the appropriate time. During the Q&A session, you may ask questions by either typing them into the chat box or raising your hand. You'll then be asked by the moderator to unmute yourself, and if you wish, turn on your camera so you can ask your questions live. Please be respectful to everyone, and please honor the guidance of the moderator to allow us to keep time and keep within our schedule. IT support is being provided, and if you run into an IT issue, please type your issue into the chat box, and one of our session advisors will respond with the appropriate IT support immediately. As we're all here joining on Zoom, a few guidance notes when using some of the important Zoom buttons. As you will see, simultaneous interpretation is available. At the bottom of your screen, to access the simultaneous interpretation function, click on the globe icon at the lower part of your screen and select your preferred language. If your preferred language is English and you wish to hear only the English, please select English. For all the other languages, you must mute the original audio so that you can clearly hear the interpretation. In today's session, we have simultaneous interpretation available in Khmer, in Tieng Viet, in Lao, in Bahasa, as well as Chinese. We also ask that during these sessions, to allow us to know who you are and to allow your colleagues to know who you are, please use and introduce yourselves using the proper name in the Zoom function. To change your name on Zoom, right-click on the Participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and on the right-hand side of your screen, look for your name. Click on the More button, and on the right side of your name, click on the Rename button. Please type in your name, your agency, and then click OK. You can also do this by introducing yourselves in the chat function. If you also wish to submit a comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, you can do so. Click on the smile icon or the reaction button, and then click Raise Your Hand. This will allow the moderator to understand that you want to make a contribution. To speak, unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon, and allow yourself to speak when called upon to do so. To show your video, of course, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from a wide range of stakeholders who we have present today, from both government, implementing agencies, as well as executing agencies, as well as the NGOs and civil society organizations that I mentioned. So in order to have this informed feedback, and the purpose of these consultations are really to hear from you, please allow me to restate ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. The Safeguard Policy Review and Update is now in phase 2 of the consultations and is intended to provide opportunities for all stakeholders to express your views and opinions on ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. As stakeholders, you're encouraged to articulate your inputs and concerns during these sessions. These, of course, will be video recorded and documented. This allows the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, as necessary, any comments and inputs made. Background materials on the thematic areas have already been released to you and will continue to be done so throughout the process of these consultations. This allows us all to better prepare for the consultations and the dialogues ahead. All types of feedback are, of course, welcome. These will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination. Session documentation summarizing this feedback will be disclosed throughout the consultations process. This will ensure the accuracy and transparency of proceedings. If you have any issues or concerns on confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any other kind of discrimination during the course of these consultations, please get in touch with the Secretariat through safeguardsupdate@adb.org. In this first consultation, we have about 2 hours. Here's what we have planned to maximize our time and your time. Firstly, Mr. Bruce Dunn will provide welcome remarks, a quick overview and approach to the SPRU. Mr. Dunn is the Director of the Safeguards Division in ADB's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Following Mr. Dunn, we have Mr. Aaron Sexton, who will present ADB's Cultural Heritage Study, including the study summary, the findings, and from a comparative analysis with other MFIs, the areas for further consideration and emerging issues, as well as the key messages. Aaron is an environmental specialist within the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Following Aaron, we will have a brief 5-minute break, after which Mr. Duncan Lang will moderate our Q&A session. This will run for about 75 minutes. Mr. Lang is a senior environmental specialist of the ADB, and he will prompt you and guide you for questions to frame the conversation. We're also honored to have Mr. Amelin Joseph Myers. Some of you may recognize the name within this particular study area, who is also a co-author of the study and former senior member of the World Bank Group. Mr. Myers has been involved in cultural heritage for about 40 years, so has extensive experience in this area. After the Q&A, please join us for a quick event evaluation before turning you back to Mr. Bruce Dunn to give us a wrap-up and a summary, as well as an indication of the next steps following this consultation. As such, and without any further ado, I'd like to now turn over the stage to Mr. Bruce Dunn, Director of the Safeguards Division, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Dunn, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Azim. And good day, welcome, and thank you to all of the participants for joining us today. It's my great pleasure to open this regional consultation on cultural heritage as part of the update of ADB's 2009 Safeguard Policy Statement. Now, as many of you know, this regional consultation is actually the 8th thematic consultation topic that we have held so far, with 7 previous sessions held last November and December 2001. And this is actually going to be the first session that we're holding in 2022. And let me also take this opportunity just to wish everyone a happy new year, a calendar new year. We're going to be, I'm sure, spending some more time together this year. We will be holding more consultations starting today, but running through until about May this year as part of a quite long series of regional consultations that are intended to explore different issues that are very important as part of reviewing our existing safeguards, as well as looking at options for the design of new policies. So very pleased that all of you could join us for this session today. Now, as Azim has mentioned in his introduction, we do have quite a diverse and mixed group of stakeholders joining. We have participants from both government as well as non-government stakeholders, including civil society and a broad range of others, mostly focused on participants from East Asia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but also participants joining from other regions. But wherever you're joining, we're very much open to hearing your views today and making this an inclusive session. Now, of course, many of you have joined previous consultation sessions, which is fantastic, and we're pleased to welcome you back. Of course, there may be people joining for the first time, so I'll just mention briefly a little bit of the background. Now, the process for updating ADB's Safeguard Policy Statement, or SPS for short, as you may hear us refer to it, was launched in August 2020. And this was after an evaluation of the SPS by ADB's Independent Evaluation Department, who had recommended that ADB should update and modernize the policy. The update process is expected to be implemented over a 2.5-year period, with the approval of the new policy being targeted by March 2023. So we've got this year ahead of us and then through until March 2023 at least. Now, the regional consultations process are actually a key foundation for the policy, and this will be feeding into the direct development of the policy itself. And following the preparation of a first draft policy, we will then move into another round of consultations on the actual draft policy itself. Now, for today's topic, we're going to be focusing in on cultural heritage, which is a very important topic, I believe, for this region. We have rich cultural diversity across Asia and the Pacific, and also a rich and diverse history in the region. And for ADB, it's also an area where the IED had suggested that ADB needs to strengthen our approach. including potentially widening the scope of the policy, which currently focuses on physical cultural heritage, to also include areas such as intangible cultural heritage. And these are going to be some of the issues that we'll explore further during the session today. So let's get into the details. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Aaron Sexton. He's an environment specialist with ADB, and he is coordinating the update of this, the work on this thematic topic for the update of the policy. He will deliver a first presentation, which is going to look at the existing policy and then the benchmarking study that we have undertaken and is available on our website. And following that, we'll go into the open session for your questions and also your broader perspectives and recommendations. So let me now hand over to Aaron. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. Good day, and thank you all for joining from so many different locations all around the world and making the effort to attend and support this policy consultation. We look forward to hearing your views and your thoughts once the presentation is complete. So the first slide, please. Thank you. This slide just shows an overview of today's presentation, and I'll take you through what we've been doing during the Cultural Heritage Review and Update. Next slide, please. So during the policy review, we have evaluated our approach to assessment and management of physical cultural resources, and also the approach of 5 other MFIs, which are the AIIB, the EBRD, the IDB, the IFC, and the World Bank. The review work was undertaken to look at gaps and similarities across the different policies and identified areas that required attention, as well as noting emerging issues that are likely to require further consideration for the future. Next slide, please. Please be aware that during the presentation, the term physical cultural resources, or PCR, will be used, as this is the term used within the ADB safeguard policy. Terms used by other MFIs include cultural heritage, cultural assets, and cultural property, to name just a few. The term PCR, or physical cultural resources, was chosen in 2009 to harmonize with the World Bank terminology. Yet during the World Bank's update of the environmental and social framework, the term cultural heritage was selected. For those not familiar with the ADB Safeguard Policy Statement, or SBS, the SBS sets out a series of policy principles that have been designed to ensure environmental soundness and sustainability across our projects. The SBS contains 3 distinct policy areas: the environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous peoples. All 3 safeguard policies involve a structured process of impact assessment, planning, and mitigation to address potentially adverse effects. In the environment policy, policy principle 11 is dedicated to conserving physical cultural resources. So the SBS defines PCR as covering all types of tangible cultural heritage, which includes movable, immovable objects, sites, structures, groups of structures, and natural features and landscapes that have archaeological, paleontological, historical, architectural, religious, aesthetic, or other cultural significance. PCR are human-made objects, natural features, or a mix of both. They can be located in urban areas, rural areas, above ground, below ground, or underwater. They are sometimes sort of found on official inventories, but often they are undiscovered. Our safeguard requirements for PCR apply when the project has potential to either indirectly or directly affect the PCR. And that's regardless of whether or not the resources are legally protected or not. Also, that stipulates that the resources will be conserved through a process of environmental assessment that requires experienced experts to conduct field studies to avoid them being damaged or destroyed. Where PCR is expected to be found on a project, specific measures will be outlined within a cultural heritage management plan. When a project assessment expects there to be no occurrence of PCR, then a chance fine procedure is developed and included in the Environmental Management Plan, or EMP. The chance fine procedure guides those responsible during the project implementation and details necessary responses if PCR is discovered. Further details of this can be checked in our safeguards policy and associated good practice guides. Finally, where PCR avoidance is not possible, the removal of PCR is prohibited unless strict conditions are met, which are further discussed in Appendix 2 of the SBS. Next slide, please. So over the last 10 plus years of applying the SBS, there have been some safeguard challenges during the assessment and implementation of projects. This slide summarizes some of the main implementation challenges across the project portfolio, and I'm just going to briefly run through a few of these. So the infrequent application of PCR safeguards can be linked to a few different reasons. For example, archaeological heritage is buried and therefore hidden from view, and it can be missed in baseline studies, especially if the required specialists are not engaged. Important built heritage, on the other hand, is hard to miss and can simply be avoided through initial project siting. Another reason could be that compared with other disciplines, cultural heritage specialists are often underrepresented among banks' environmental and social staff, which is true of most MFIs. So it can be expected that the application of PCR safeguard measures is perhaps less frequent than other disciplines. Excuse me. It's also worth noting that heritage of importance to local communities can be left unprotected by national regulations. Communities may notice this, but simply accept the loss as unavoidable. Across the 68 developing member countries, or DMCs, that we support, there's often a great deal of variance, both in the PCR located in each region and also within the internal capacity standards and regulations within any given DMC. So while PCR experts are highly regarded in DMCs, a potential challenge is that the management or assessment of PCR may not follow international practice, which can lead to misinterpretation of the importance of any resource. If this occurs, there's a risk that the baseline may be insufficient, which I'll come to shortly, which can prevent a robust assessment, which then can impact the project. Where PCR assessment is shifted to the pre-construction stage of the project, this can result in significant project costs, construction delays, project redesign, increased compensation payments, and increased land acquisition needs. Another challenge we face as safeguard officers is that the policy currently lacks detail around baseline data collection, only setting out that the requirement of field-based surveys is required. With the lack of description about what is needed, assessment and reporting can be very varied. The absence of this detail also restricts our ability to formally request additional surveys and assessments. The requirement of archaeological investigations is also not explicitly mentioned in the SBS. Another area worth mentioning is that while stakeholder consultation is fundamental to the assessment process of each project, the current policy does not specify the need to integrate social and community PCR interests. This may result in important cultural features or resources not being recorded, assessed, and ultimately protected. The same issue was identified during the analytical study of the 5 comparator MFIs and is discussed in the next slide. Next slide, please. So an analytical study was undertaken to compare ADB's overall approach to assessment and management of impacts on PCR with that of the 5 comparator MFIs. Overall, as you can see in this slide, the study found that the ADB policy principles require strengthening and perhaps greater clarity or guidance to support implementation, which is likely to include the need for additional safeguard language. As the title Physical Cultural Resources suggests, the current policy only addresses physical manifestations of cultural heritage and does not address intangible cultural heritage such as traditional knowledge and practices. This limitation is also implied in ADB's Indigenous Peoples Policy, where reference to cultural resources is focused upon physical resources. The analytical study showed that intangible cultural heritage is addressed by other MFIs, although in different scales and scope. 3 of the MFI policies limited the protection of intangible heritage only to commercial uses, whereas more stringent and wider reaching protection of intangible cultural heritage is exemplified by the EBRD and the World Bank policies that encompass practices, representations, expressions, and knowledge, amongst other aspects. Providing some level of protection to intangible heritage is something that we are interested to investigate further, and it'd be great to hear your views and opinions of this during the upcoming discussion. Next slide, please. The next 2 slides show areas that we think need further consideration. Overall, ADB's approach to PCR presently relies on the impact assessment process and applicable national laws, as do other MFIs. So from this perspective, ADB policy is well aligned with sort of best practice globally. However, specific cultural heritage requirements identified in the SBS itself are less detailed. So we now have an opportunity to address this. You can see on the slide that there is need to better define cultural heritage, to create more guidance, and to better appreciate what types of heritage exist and how they're used. Next slide, please. Continuing from the previous slide, you can see that more considerations we wish to address to shore up practices, improve data collection, enhance guidance provision, and eliminate recurring issues. If you have your own examples and experiences of these issues or examples of best available technologies, you can share these views in our discussion. Next slide, please. The analysis conducted also provided an opportunity to investigate emerging trends and themes. So we interrogated various documents from MFIs, UNESCO, national regulations, and other literature on cultural heritage. And we found the 5 following key points shown in the slide. So number 1, there's a need to better identify patterns of heritage in Asia and subregions of Asia. Number 2 is that there is the potential to improve assessment in protection of marine heritage. Number 3, to address human burial in local community settings. Number 4, to improve assessment techniques through the use of better technologies. And number 5 is to see cultural heritage as an opportunity rather than a barrier to any projects. We intend to include emergent issues such as these within the continuing policy update discussion, and we welcome comments on these emergent issues or other areas that you consider important or of interest moving forward. Next slide, please. So here are the takeaway messages from the presentation. So the SBS has gaps that we think need addressing. Other MFIs are aligned in their cultural heritage policy principles. There's a need to improve the current policy by providing more detail, clarity, and guidance. There's an opportunity for us to work towards greater protection for cultural heritage and to achieve effective compliance. And also, there's an opportunity to include new concepts and emerging themes. Next slide, please. Also, a slide before. And that's okay. There's one more slide we'll get to after the break. Thank you so much for your time for listening, and we look forward to discussion shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Aaron, and also Bruce. And we'd now like to move to a facilitated discussion session. But before we actually do, let me just briefly recap the highlights of Aaron's presentation. Is that there's a need for ADB to consider deeper and stronger alignment with other IFIs and emerging technical and impact issues, which covers a number of areas, including, firstly, as Aaron mentioned, the SPS has gaps compared to other MFIs, and changes may be necessary to enhance the current policy and provide greater clarity for implementation. Of course, we'll be discussing this in Duncan's Q&A session. Secondly, that MFIs are increasingly aligned to cultural heritage policy principles and thus provide an opportunity for such convergence to occur. Thirdly, that the ADB would like to improve practice, including in areas such as inclusion and separate standards, and that such policy can occur to protect cultural heritage and achieve better, more improved and effective compliance. And finally, that there's an opportunity to include such concepts, including intangible cultural heritage and other emerging themes. And in these 5 areas, we hope to have a facilitated discussion, again, as I mentioned, moderated by Mr. Duncan Lang, after our 5-minute break. You will see at the top of your screen on the right-hand side a countdown timer. So if for those of you stepping away from your screens, you will hear some background music. As that background music fades away and permanently ceases, that's an indication to you that you should be returning to your screens because we're starting the Q&A session. As well, if you wish to mute your audio, you can see the countdown timer, and as that countdown timer approaches 0, you will know to also return to your screen. But before we do, let me just take an opportunity to ask you to think about, during the break, a question that we have that will require a narrative response from participants, and that is a mentee poll. Some of you may be familiar with the app, but the question is, how can the ADB improve the effectiveness of these consultations? What are 1 or 2 ideas that you may have that the ADB could implement to improve the effectiveness of these consultations? And as I mentioned, we will get back to you with your responses to that question after the break. Again, after the break, you can post your question either on video chat by clicking the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by typing your question into the chat box in any one of our 5 languages that we have available today. So with that, we will see you in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everybody, for our Q&A session moderated by Mr. Duncan Lang, who's a Senior Environmental Specialist of the Safeguards Division. You will have seen some guiding questions for both round 1 and round 2 of the facilitated discussion, for which we have about 75 minutes. But again, that timing is flexible because what we want is to hear from you. Just a reminder that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you click on reactions, there is the raise hand emoji or icon, and that will allow Mr. Duncan Lang to know that you want to make an intervention or contribution based on your experience, or raise a question to any of the panelists available to respond. We also do not want English to be a limiting factor in the discussion. So if you wish to make a contribution, share an experience in Chinese, Bahasa Indonesia, Khmer, Lao, or Vietnamese, please feel free to do so in the chat box. With that, I would now like to call upon Mr. Lang to take the floor and remind us of how and in which order he will be taking questions. So Mr. Lang, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Azim, and hopefully everybody can hear me okay. You never know these days with the internet. It's lovely to be here and to do the moderating for this session. So as Azim said, we'll have kind of 2 rounds really for this session, and hopefully you had a good look at the questions that we had kind of outlined there. But if you have any other things that you want to bring up, they are very welcome here in this forum. So the way I'm going to run the session is really give first off an opportunity for anybody who has any opening statements, any perspectives, or also any raised hands would like to speak. Then secondly, as you can see on the slide now, we have questions that have been sent in advance through the Zoom registration. And third will be going back to the chat box, and again with participants having raised their hands, and we'll try and do that in batches. We'll try and do it in the order that everybody raises their hand or puts a question into the chat, but we very much welcome your input. So at the moment we don't, here we do, wonderful. Thank you, Minnie. So Minnie, if I can pass to you, just turn yourself off mute. The floor is yours for the first question. Thank you very much for stepping in.
Thank you so much. I'm Minnie Degawan Akankanai Igorot, working with Conservation International based here in the Philippines. Yes, having a safeguard on cultural heritage is very important. It is becoming even more so as more of indigenous resources are being looked at for extraction. I was looking at the study that was conducted, and one of the recommendations that I would raise would be the participation of communities in the whole process, in the identification of these cultural heritage, physical or not physical, and all that, especially knowledge holders. We have to remember that communities have different protocols for discussing these different aspects of our cultures, and often it cannot be left to so-called experts, especially experts from outside the community, to do the identification. In our experience in Conservation International, while our projects are definitely not extractive and less intrusive, we have found out that the best way of getting communities to open up about this very, very sensitive issue is that we have to develop the trust, and that trust development takes time. So ADB projects cannot hope to be able to identify, come up with a cultural heritage plan, mitigate whatever effects it will have in 2 years, 3 years, because even within the communities, elders are not very open to discussing some of these issues with the youth. There are protocols to follow for the identification, not simply identification, but even for the use of these heritage sites. So I would ask that, in any safeguards that's going to be established, that the participation of knowledge holders and the entire community is a very important component. I see that there is already the identification of the need to be sensitive, culturally sensitive in this process. And I would like to see a guide or a guide that would make sure that all these elements are considered. On the issue of technology, yes, technology can be very helpful, but at the same time, it can also be very intrusive. Sometimes it can result in unintended consequences, the use of drones, and often some of our heritage sites are hidden, quote unquote, but with the use of drones, they are suddenly recorded and sometimes then shared widely. So again, there has to be a safeguard in the use of technology. So thanks for this initial discussion, and hope to hear more from ADB and the others. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Gawan. That was extremely helpful. A great question there. So I've tried to summarize, because there was a lot there, and then I will perhaps get some feedback from Aaron and the rest of the team. So first off, your recommendation was that communities are involved in the process throughout the entire cycle of a project, for example, that communities have a much more different system for discussing cultural heritage, and that needs to involve people. So we need to think about that. We need to develop a level of trust with communities for people who are looking at cultural heritage, and the project time frame that we often use is not does not necessarily work well with that, because you might need 2 or 3 years, say, to do that. Then you think that we could develop, well, we need some additional guidance on how we need to do these assessments, etc. And then lastly, the use of technology. It can be useful, but can also be bad as well. So perhaps if I could turn perhaps to Aaron initially, and then perhaps if we need, Bruce can jump in afterwards with any further feedback. So Aaron, if I could pass to you with any initial responses to the questions.
Thank you, Duncan. And thank you, Mr. Gawan, for your comments. Yeah, you make some really great points there. And I think hopefully I covered some of that in the presentation, which was reflective of the analytical study. There was an awareness made to us, not only from our in practical terms, from our projects that we've understood from discussions internally with ADB, but also from the studies that we conducted, that was led by our consultant, that obviously consultation is fundamental to any success of a project, and we're fully aware that we need to strengthen how we look at receiving information from anything related to cultural heritage or PCR moving forward. You make a really good point. In terms of technology, yeah, that's another great point. It's super challenging that on one hand, there's so much potential there to enable a project to better assess the project and the potential impacts, and that can at times, with the technologies available at the moment, make the process more efficient and more effective. But also, as you mentioned, there's a level of being intrusive, or perhaps some areas or locations or regions don't want that technology to be applied. So something that certainly needs to be discussed further and needs to be looked at both in sort of terms of a policy sense, and then perhaps also a guidance sense as well. I don't have many other notes to add to that, but thank you so much for your comments, and they're really important ones. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Aaron. That's very helpful feedback there. Mr. Gawan, did Aaron answer your questions sufficiently? Is there anything else you'd like to add to the response to him, or did he answer everything as
Yes.
as you? Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Is there anything else you'd like to add on to what Aaron said at all as well?
Well, thanks very much, Duncan, and thank you so much, Minnie Degawan, for joining. You've joined previous consultations, and it's great to have you back again today. In fact, your points resonate a lot with me. Prior to my time with ADB, actually many years prior, I was fortunate to spend some time living with an Indigenous community in the Northern Territory of Australia, the Mirror people. And the issues that you're mentioning are actually very pertinent there, because there were very many culturally sensitive sites, natural sites as well as cultural heritage sites, that were very important to the local community that were under threat from development. But there were quite a number of challenging issues in terms of, even within the community, there was protected knowledge, where not all community members knew of the existence of certain sites, and there were protocols established within the community as to who and when and how they would receive information about those sites. And so then considering those sites in the context of development and disclosing their whereabouts is a very important issue that needed to be worked through sensitively. So I think that's an important message for this work, and clearly recognition of these issues would be very important in the policy, but also, as you suggest, as we come to guidance, how should these issues around community engagement, around cultural heritage, the role of experts, as well as the work of the communities, and then your important points around technology are also very well noted. And I would highlight that technology, but also confidentiality aspects would also be, very, very important there. You touched on. So thank you once again. Very well noted.
Thanks very much, Bruce, for the follow-up remarks. They're much appreciated. So we do have another hand up. May I turn over to Katrini Kobuntubua? Excuse my pronunciation if I've got that wrong. Katrini, over to you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's okay. My name is really a difficult one, so it's okay. Well, my name is Katrini. I'm from the Indonesian Heritage Trust, and I was 6 years, became the safeguard specialist for the social safeguard at the World Bank in Jakarta. And now I'm working from home, from my home village in Bali. So this is my backyard. So to give you more enthusiasm for having this important show. Well, I really thank for your presentation and the plan that ADB would like to be involved more for the cultural heritage. I mean, this is important. From the previous time, I and my friends and my colleagues in the Indonesian Heritage Trust is trying to promote that the cultural heritage is not a dichotomy with the nature heritage, especially for the one in Asia. We are in the region, as in Asia is very strong for believing how we conserve our culture and our nature is really based on the tradition, and that means the culture is the basis to conserve the nature. So this is something that is blended together, and there should be no dichotomy if we are planning for having the development in the term of nature, and this will be separated with the culture. But for us, it's one into another is really integrated strongly. So this is also having the impact. If we talk about the cultural landscape, we talk about how we conserve not only the PCR, the physical things, but also the intangible one is coming together. And if we talk, I read through about your presentation from Mr. Bruce or Mr. Aaron, I think this is true, that really important. If we talk about consultation with the people, is really important, because since the beginning, I talk about the nature heritage, the culture heritage, and the tradition and the people is coming together. And if we do something, we plan something, and the people have to be involved. And it's not only the consultation, but as Mr. Bruce just mentioned, it's about sharing the knowledge. Because so long when I was at the World Bank, it's always that we try to listen to the people, but then when we left the village, the people have nothing, because they question about what they're doing in their village, but they don't have any comparison. What are the people thinking about their heritage? So this is really important to give also the ideas. The outsider, the people beyond their village, think about their heritage is like this. So this is really will enrich the idea and the way that they can plan the development or the progress in their village. So this is also something not easy for having a good discussion with the people. It's not only because of the language, but also and also the character, but the way that we appreciate the heritage. Sometimes we understand that the people in the village, they didn't know what is the law, what is the regulation that have to be followed, but they just understand because when they were born, it's have to do like this and that. So this is also the way we have to help them to discover why this have to be done like this. And this is really interesting for having, for instance, like a cultural mapping together, and then also have a discussion. And beyond of this, what I would like to say is there is no instant project. I understand that ADB, or World Bank, or other international institution, we have the name of project that sometimes it's scare for the people. Or there is a project and they will make a distance with the people because of the project. And we would like to making it friendly to the community. And we have to have several stages, not coming as a people from the project in the beginning, but we have to have make a friend with them. We have to have also the trust with the people that this is not only the name of the project, and after the project done, everything is gone, but they will have the responsibility to make it sustain. So this is really important. So along all my small experience in this field, what I would like also to challenge the ADB is maybe there are several stages for making sure that is a preliminary before the project, what should be done. And then as well, you already having the plan and analytical process for the period when the project is happening. And then after that, also the monitoring and all the things. And the monitorings can be, this is also something new, if we can say that the monitoring from the bank can be due after certain years, and then the monitoring from the local people, and they will still there because they are not based on the project. So they're still there in the village. They have to have in their mind or in their local regulation or village law, after certain years, they will have also the monitoring of what they're doing together with ADB. So this is really the meaning of sustainability, according to me. So I think that's all my comments. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That was a really great question, lots in there. So I'll try and paraphrase that and then put it over to the team. So Katrina, I think you were saying that basically culture and nature are linked, and we really need to think of that together. That I think is something that you will hear more back on. I think I agree with you. We need to consider intangible cultural heritage. We also need to do a better job with consultation throughout the process of any project development. We also need to have the consultation and the the discussion with the local community in a bilateral fashion, so that it's two-way, so that we get everybody to think about the cultural heritage, what others think of the cultural heritage in a project area, versus what the local people think as well, to make sure that that is considered, and also to talk about the laws and regulations there. And then you're also talking about the challenges that we have in the project life cycle, and that to involve local people in the monitoring there, particularly in the long term. So there's quite a lot to unpack there, but if I can perhaps turn it over to Aaron to start with, and then perhaps Bruce, if you'd like to top up anything from Aaron, that would be great as well. So Aaron, do you want to go first, and then perhaps Bruce can jump in afterwards? Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina, for the questions. That's great. Yeah, I think one thing that perhaps didn't come out in the presentation that needs to occur in the future is that yeah, you're right. There's very much an integration between sort of culture and nature. They're intertwined. You can't disconnect them, and that's something that is going to have to happen during our policy update. But there's going to be cross-cutting issues across Indigenous peoples, biodiversity, and cultural heritage, and those discussions will be ongoing to make sure that those issues are surfaced and discussed, and then in some way managed and addressed. And yeah, and you're right. There's obviously such a variance in meaningful consultation, and how to apply it. And one of the challenges, I guess, that working in so many countries is we face is the quality of the consultation and the depth of it. And I worked in Cambodia for about 7 years on and off, and yeah, I saw there that it's so important to have clarity when describing what the project is, how it's going to affect people, and then to have, like you mentioned, more of a trust and relationship built with the people on the ground. And that's something that I hope we already do to some degree, and I hope that we practice that as best as possible. And yeah, I think currently we have commitments to monitoring on the ground as well, depending on the sort of scale and scope of the project. So I hope those things in the latter of your points are active currently in our practices in ADB. But thank you so much for your points, and hopefully they can be strengthened further in our policy and guidance. So I'll hand to Bruce for some more responses to that. But thanks, Katrina.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Katrina Ibu. Katrina, really appreciated your perspectives there. And I think, again, it reinforces the points from Mini Thegawam, the earlier points that she made around working with community and understanding the relationships with the cultural heritage and nature and the community, and making that a process. And one of the key points I took away from you was the whole process of engagement, which shouldn't just be about the project itself, but set in the wider context of the importance to cultural heritage and what that means to the community, and what it means beyond the project itself, and how to manage that. There's another link there, which is also around the longer term opportunities for sustainable management of cultural heritage, which go beyond just a project level safeguard. And I think that's something where development projects certainly need to take the opportunity to see if there's chances to support that as well. Sometimes it can be a bit limiting in the context of a project, which comes with a certain mandate and resources. And when we look at safeguards, we're typically looking at managing risks. But it's very important for us to understand that wider context, and then from a development perspective, see if there's opportunities to also support longer term development. And I think some of the key points that you were mentioning point us in that direction as well. Like with other topics, biodiversity, for example, managing risks in the project context is one issue, but taking a wider development perspective around conservation and nature is important as well. So that's something that we need to consider in the context of the policy development moving forward. So thank you again. Really appreciate your really insightful comments.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Aaron, for feedback. Katrini, is there anything else from your perspective that you'd like to add to the to follow up on those responses, or anything else you'd like to raise?
I think it's enough for time being. There are no others raised hands.
We have one, so I will turn over in a second. But if there's anything else, we do have time. If you feel like there's anything else you'd like to raise, feel free to go ahead.
It's okay. I will write some things to enrich the analytical review.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Okay, so with that, maybe I could turn to Camila Biag from the DOTR, I think, in the Philippines. Camila, thanks for your earlier question, but it would be great if we could get your feedback directly here now. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, hello, good morning. Excuse the lack for video. Yeah, coming from the implementing agency, but I do like to drive the point of Ms. Degawan and Ms. Katrini regarding the involvement of the community and how right now we're moving towards having communities and traditional stakeholders as part of the entire process, and it's not only expert-led. So that's one important thing that we have to take note of and really drive. But another thing is that I'm not sure if the language is clear, but what I read from this current safeguards is that it assumes that most sites and properties have management systems or plans in place. And that's often not the case, which us for the implementing agencies, we do struggle with, because we do want to produce objective and credible impact assessments. We do want to screen our sites properly to make sure that we're not hitting any sensitive areas, etc. But the screening has to be better, since we're basically working with with very little information or data. If we don't have a management plan, or if it takes a while to get the communities involved. It takes a while to build trust. So often we need to screen really quickly and really better, because we have to mitigate any impact that the project will have. So I think that's one thing that's probably going to relate as well to the discussion for environmental impact assessments as a whole. But I'd like to emphasize improving the screening methods, and not just simply limiting properties to or sites into types. Again, the context of Asia, it's layered. In some sites, you can't really separate culture and nature. And I think Ms. Katrini already drove that point, but I really like to emphasize that it's so difficult to separate some sites in terms of nature and culture. And as well as, it's not just nature or culture, it's also the community that's also could be or is part of that heritage. And most of the screening methods would just place these properties and sites into neat little boxes that don't really work for the context sometimes. And that's all actually that I'd like to add, because I already posted some questions as well via the Zoom link and through email. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Camila. That was very helpful feedback there. And perhaps, I think because this is perhaps going towards the wider process of our impact assessment, maybe I can start off with Bruce here to feedback on this one. Bruce, would you like to go first on this one?
Sure, thank you very much. Really appreciated that from Ms. Camila Biag from Department of Transport in the Philippines. Some important points. I appreciated also the comments that you had made prior to the session kicking off around a people-centered approach and also a culture nature sensitive approach, which is very much linked to the issues that Minnie Dewagan and Ms. Katrini had mentioned earlier. Obviously, people are shaped by the landscapes and nature around them, and then they in turn shape and blend those in terms of their culture and heritage. So that dynamic is extremely important to understand. And I do think one of the key messages already coming from just this short period of the consultation is the need for better guidance, and linking that to your point as well around screening. This is a challenge because often I've seen a lot of work of the EIA has been sort of derogated down to chance find procedures, where we're not really doing a lot of detailed screening in terms of cultural heritage or nature cultural linkages at an earlier stage. And if it's found, then it's dealt with. But that doesn't allow you to then have that earlier process of a people-focused approach as being recommended. So the screening process being informed through stakeholder engagement, I see as being quite important and something to look at. Now, one thing that I'll mention here moving forward is that we are going to be looking at the whole process of screening and categorization for our safeguards and taking a more integrated approach. Currently, the safeguards at the moment for ADB are divided into 3 areas. As I think many of you know, we have environment safeguards, then we have involuntary resettlement, and then Indigenous peoples, and we screen and categorize for those issues separately. So the interrelationships are not coming out, and that's very important, I think, in the context of cultural heritage. It sits at the moment, physical cultural heritage within the environment safeguards, but we're not making those linkages across as strongly as we should be. So revisiting the screening process for how we identify cultural heritage and recognizing that there will be gaps in baseline information and the need to sort of strengthen that baseline analysis. Same time, though, of course, we need to make it practical. You know, I can imagine for you coming from a government perspective, Department of Transport, you know, you need to have processes that are going to be practical and can be implemented within reasonable timeframes. So, you know, how can we make use of existing information data sets at a national level, but while also strengthening those with information from communities, you know, looking at the relationships between those, I'd see as being important as well. But thank you again, many important points coming out so far. Let me see if Aaron has anything to add.
Thanks, Bruce. On this occasion, I think you've wrapped up pretty well there. But yeah, I mean, I sort of sense your frustration and concerns there on the screening. Even from our point of view, that rapid assessment that we have at the moment is quite simplistic, and more detailed, I think, would help the process sort of moving forward. So nothing further from me on that question. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, Bruce and Aaron there. Camilla, I've got your question, so we'll come back to that later and I'll read it out. But is there anything you'd like to respond just straight away to Bruce and Aaron on that?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much as well. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. So moving forward, we do have first off a question that was sent in at as part of the registration process from Mary Elaine Igot. We also have in the chat a question from Sao Bottom Roath from Cambodia, I think, and also a couple of questions from Grace Barreto Tesoro. So perhaps since maybe we could turn to Mary Elaine, if you'd be happy to voice your question here. If not, no worries, I can read it out. It would be good to hear from you. So Mary Elaine, if you're there, we'd love to hear from you. If not, I'll read out the question perhaps. Okay, I take it you're not, or maybe it's having a difficulty. So perhaps I will read out the question. That might be a good way to go in this. Let me just get back to it. Okay, so the question is how to maintain and preserve cultural treasure in a very practical manner and not spend so much. So Aaron, perhaps I can turn to you first to respond to this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Also, thanks, Duncan, and thank you for the question, Mary. Yeah, it's a good one. I think there's an awareness that we need to be quite efficient with our procedures and protocols when we're looking to sort of preserve cultural treasures or heritage or PCRs there. But I think I sort of mentioned in the presentation that we need to have a pretty sort of thorough sort of screening process as well to ensure that there's no issues that we overlook during the baseline collection and also through the process of assessment. So I think I mentioned a few times in the presentation that if you sort of overlook the PCR, then there can be ramifications of this moving forward that can affect the project. So I don't think there's any sort of shortcuts or way out of doing a sort of thorough assessment and make sure that we're screening properly. So yeah, I think that's my answer for now. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks for that, Aaron. I don't know, Bruce, if you want to add anything else on top of that.
Just briefly, Duncan, there's always trade-off between the level of effort in terms of, say, upfront assessment and planning and consultation and costs. And the other side, though, is that what we've seen from past projects where gaps in the screening process or the baseline assessment can come back and have significant costs later, potentially to impacts to important cultural heritage sites, but also, if not screened appropriately, but then identified later, either through community concerns or through chance finds, can certainly lead to lengthy delays with projects. And that itself would have significant costs as well, maybe changes in project design that would need to accommodate important cultural heritage or archaeological findings, maybe just delays. So I think a balance is certainly needed where the right level of effort for that particular context and location and community is placed so that we get it right up front. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bruce. That's very helpful feedback there. So perhaps now I can next turn to Sao Botum-Ruath. Sao, I've seen you on a number of the consultation sessions, so it's nice to see you again. You always provide great feedback to us. So would you like to come in to complement what you wrote in the chat there? If you do, the floor is yours, or I can read out your point in the chat.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Botum-Ruath. I like to include the EMP, but this EMP should be conduct before the project approval, like we do before the designing of EMP, because the place that I mentioned in Cambodia is in Angkor region. The place is rich of ancient temple or ancient city in the past. So Cambodia have authority there to implement and to preserve, to conserve the temple, the city. But we would like to. I just like to include in the ADB policy that should we design should we have a kind of mitigation measure before approval of the project? That's just my contribution question in this policy. But yes, that's all.
Thank you, Sao. That's really interesting question, and appreciate that feedback. So I guess really with kind of thinking about the project process, and that if we put because we do have a requirement to do an EMP, and usually they are part of the impact assessment work. But I think what I read from your question, which I'll put across to the others at the moment, is that it's not enough what is done in the EMP is too late, and you need to do this screening, this work up front to ensure that the project is not going to have an impact prior to doing the mitigation part later down the line, which is a great feedback to us. If that's correct, then I can pass that question on to Aaron. Mr. Sao, is that correct way of interpretation of your point there?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me put it over to Aaron for you now. Aaron, have you got any initial feedback?
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Al. Yeah, I hope to some degree that is already applied through our projects, that we have ample stakeholder consultation with departments and ministries, that all the authorities within the area, especially around Angkor Wat and you know, sort of the highest level sort of World Heritage site that is. Yeah, and I think sort of to Duncan's point as well. Yeah, I mean, we hopefully through a process of assessment have already created an EMP that's suitable to the potential impacts within the projects, and they're removed or minimized prior to that even starting. So I guess that, you know, as an application of mitigation hierarchy before we start, and hopefully the EMP is reflective of that. But having worked in Cambodia for some time as well, I appreciate that sometimes perhaps some of the measures aligned or set out in the EMP aren't always implemented on the ground. So I think that's a challenge that we face as well. It's actual sort of monitoring and making sure that all the impacts are reduced and minimized to how the EMP has set them out. So I hope that answers your question to some degree, and if not, please add any further points, Bruce or Duncan. Thank you.
Duncan, I can just come in a little bit more here. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sao Pottomrath. It's nice to see you again joining the consultation today. A couple of things that I'd mention here. One, Aaron has already mentioned the mitigation hierarchy, and I think this is extremely important here to emphasize that the priority within our existing policy, and something that we think will be important moving forward, is that avoidance is always the place to start, and then, you know, moving through to a process of mitigation and management. Offsets, though, I think offsets in terms of cultural heritage are extremely difficult, so mitigation is going to be extremely important. I'd highlight here also, you know, cultural heritage comes with different significance, although significance can be quite subjective as well. You know, significance to who? Of course, we have sites of important world heritage, such as the Angkor sites that you've mentioned. But there's also sites for cultural heritage that are going to be extremely important to local communities, even if not registered or recognized at a wider level. But significance is going to be very important, as is looking at the potential risks to the cultural heritage and the complexity and the feasibility of management. So we certainly would need to place stronger emphasis on avoidance, and stronger emphasis on having well-developed management plans, environmental management plans, cultural heritage management plans, and processes upfront for sites of significant importance or where there are significant risks. But there may also be degrees of need for or opportunity for further ongoing work after a project has been included. And this also segues a little bit to one of the points from Ms. Katrini also earlier, where we do need to consider this sort of wider context that goes beyond a project itself in terms of how cultural heritage sites are managed in the longer term. So I think that's very important. But I guess in summary, your point around having well-developed management plans in place and having them done early is something we would certainly agree with. But placing that in the context of an appropriate screening process the application of the mitigation hierarchy, and then understanding the significance and complexity of management. Those issues would then shape sort of, when and how and the level of effort that you would need to put in, and the level of resources and expertise and work with the community that would be needed. So I think there's quite a mix of issues to consider in there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce, for the follow-up there. Mr. Bottomruath, has that answered your question? I think you got quite a bit of good feedback there on that. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, just I think it's because in Siem Reap City we have urban development that encroach on the ancient city of Angkor. Yeah, or like archaeological places or cultural places in that. That's why I contribute. If we can put this into the ADB safeguard policy, it is great. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much for that further feedback. Yeah, Bruce, I was going to ask if there's anything else you wanted to say. I was thinking about the UNESCO aspects and exclusions as well. It's something that we've been discussing in other subjects, but that might be something to feed back on, particularly in relevance to Angkor and others there. So back to you, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan, and thank you again, Mr. Bottomruath. So there was two things that I wanted to touch on. One was your last point also reminds us around the need to look at the wider development context and cumulative impacts that may be affecting cultural heritage, particularly you have a complex of sites and we need to look at that wider complex and where they exist and how they're managed, not just sort of parachute in and only look at a very narrow context of a project. So that I think is important. The second, yes, Duncan's point around exclusions. So the notion of having certain sites that should be excluded from development has come up in some of the previous consultations, particularly in the context of the consultations I think you may have joined for biodiversity. Are there certain sites, such as UNESCO World Heritage sites, that should be excluded from forms of development? So that's something that we're looking at and considering and would welcome further feedback on from various different stakeholders. It's relevant to cultural heritage sites of natural significance, such as for their biodiversity values, but also for their cultural heritage values. In our team, we've been discussing this actually quite vigorously around the pros and cons of taking such an approach. We can certainly see the importance of protecting key sites from development, but also some trade-offs in understanding that there may be certain types of development activities that are needed to actually conserve or sustainably use sites in the long term, and you don't want to prohibit that at the same time. So there's a sort of a relationship of those issues, but very much welcome hearing from other stakeholders, yourself, of course, Mr. Bottomruath, but other stakeholders around the notion of exclusions or how to sustainably work around cultural heritage sites. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bruce. Mr. Bottomruath, is there anything else you'd finally like to respond on that point, or I'll turn it over for another question we've had through the chat?
No, so far, no.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for your very helpful feedback. So perhaps next I could turn to Grace Barreto Tesoro. We see you've got a couple of questions in there. The second one, I think, is more relating to the actual structure of our policy update. And the first one is more cultural heritage specific. So can I turn the floor to you if you're happy to voice your questions, or I can read them out.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you.
Okay, my internet connection is poor, so no camera for this morning. so thank you for letting us know that there is, and for inviting participants from Southeast Asia to include us in the development of this document. So the first question that I had or comment is kindly include in the policy a flowchart of the process so that we know where we should be involved in and up to what extent. And this will also allow us to follow up the entire thing. And second, I know that the policy has been followed or started in 2010, but you are going to, as I understand, you want to improve the document, hence this consultation. I would like to request another round of consultation after you have implemented all the comments and suggestions, not just from Southeast Asia, but from the entire Asia. I understand you have several consultations after this with different regions, such as South Asia, okay, and I think the Pacific Islands, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so we'd like to have a look at that document again, and maybe to further improve it, we just want to see what has been implemented or incorporated, and then maybe you can make more suggestions or comments based on the newly that document. And then yes, there's different parts of Southeast Asia, different parts of Asia have different natures of physical, cultural resources and heritage. And I think it would be best if the policy would include country-based funds. I understand and I see that there are many participants from mainland Southeast Asia, and they are mostly concerned with their built heritage, such as temples, and it's something that is obviously absent from the Philippines. So that's why I am requesting that policy should be adjusted based on the countries where APP is sponsoring projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Barreto Tesoro. That's really helpful feedback. I think given there's quite an element of policy context and where we are with the structure of the safeguard policy update, maybe I will turn over to Bruce first to respond on that point first, and then perhaps Sharon can give you feedback with how our policies we want to evolve it to be relevant in Southeast Asia and the countries that we cover as part of ADB. So Bruce, can I turn to you first for an initial response?
Yes, thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you, Ms. Barreto Tesoro, for those comments. So I'll speak a little bit about the process first. So these regional consultations are providing some feedback on the initial drafts of the summary analytical studies. We're then going to be taking all of the recommendations from the different consultations and from different stakeholder groups, governments and civil society, non-government organizations. We'll be using that to update the papers, and then we'll actually be publishing further papers on each of these topics. So we're expecting those to be published within the next 6 months. It depends actually on the date of the consultation and then when the paper is completed, but progressively we'll be releasing those full papers. Now they'll be available for further public consultation and written inputs, but we will also have other rounds of consultations. We will be having what we're calling deep dive consultations in about 10 countries, where we will be having more dedicated sort of national discussions with governments as well as with civil society to get specific feedback. That will all then feed into the development of the draft policy. And then once there's a draft policy, we'll go into further rounds of consultations. So it's an iterative process, and there are certainly opportunities to get feedback. Supplementing that, we are also having some focus group discussions. And so we're going to be reaching out to various different individuals and organizations to get more specific feedback on some of the recommendations. So that's something we'll be following up on the sidelines, and certainly, welcome any further recommendations after this consultation process. So I'll stop there. I'll pass back to Duncan and to Aaron for some further reflections.
Thanks, Bruce. So Aaron, perhaps you could provide some feedback on how we can, consider country-based sensitivities and differences in cultural heritage. Built heritage is obviously in certain countries much more obvious and more intangible and more possible archaeological in other countries. So how do we have any thoughts on how we can build the policy that will reflect the differences? Thanks.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I think this was discussed very briefly as an emerging trend within the presentation. I think we had a brief discussion about the idea that there's a need to identify different heritage that has, evolved in different sort of geographical space and is sort of influenced by different environmental factors also. There's like distinctive patterns of cultural heritage in different parts. There's certainly a need to identify the different regions and sub-regions with which it sort of lies. And I think there's an intention or plan to address this perhaps in guidance that will support the policy update moving forward. It needs more time and thought, but I think that we showed in the summary report or perhaps analytical study that there's already sort of protocols out there that have looked to address this, including the sort of Hoyan protocol, and there's some other papers I think that I shared in the references section there. So yeah, it's a very valuable comment made, and definitely needs sort of more thought and consideration. So thank you for your comment.
Thanks, Aaron. Ms. Barato Tesoro, is there anything you'd like to feedback on following the responses?
Thank you very much, Aaron Sexton, for your response, and we hope that we can get an invitation to join the focus group discussion. I am from the University of the Philippines at the Archaeological Studies program, and we'd very much to be active in this kind of regional activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very well noted, and I'm sure that we would love to have you to be involved in the process. So thank you very much for that. We're well on time with the session. We've had some great feedback, but maybe I could just use the opportunity now to first off ask whether there's any interest or for any questions that might come up from other participants from different geographies that have not given any feedback yet. We do have people here from Laos, PDR, People's Republic of China, Thailand, Mongolia, Vietnam, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. So if there's any feedback from any of those countries, we would very much welcome it. We could also take this opportunity to perhaps move into a bit more of a round two to consider questions about what ADB could be doing. So as you can see on the screen, we've had a lot of interesting feedback directly about the policy, but where we go from here, that's something that we'd be very keen to get feedback on. What aspects of comparative MFI cultural heritage policy should ADB support, continue to support? What areas of comparative MFI cultural heritage policies should ADB take a different approach on? What could we do better? I think we've heard quite a bit about that. And also good practices from other areas outside of the MFIs. I do know that we have, I think, not sorry to maybe single out, but we do have Arlene, I think, Fleming on the call here today from IAIA, and you may have some feedback on good international practice there Eileen, but the floor is open for anybody from any of those other developing member countries who would like to provide feedback, and we would welcome any different feedback on where we should be going moving forward. This is the open door session, so we're really trying to get that feedback from you. This is very much the listening mode, listening mode for ADB. So if you do have any feedback, now is the time to share it. So yes, any feedback, or I will start asking our team questions, and they probably won't like that. So if you do have any feedback, now's the time to jump in, anybody. No feedback? Not yet. Okay, so while we're here, we had that interesting question about technology, which I had never even considered about the negative aspects of it. I've often thought about the positive side of technology and understanding cultural heritage better. But is there anything that we feel in ADB that where we could be mandating the use of technology more to actually improve our assessments? Aaron, do you think there's any scope for that? And how do we do that sensitively, perhaps? Maybe I can just ask that quick question.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I think to hammer your point, I wasn't entirely aware that obviously this is quite an intrusive process, and there are probably many that would prefer not to have the technology included within the assessment process. From my exposure, my experience in this field, obviously the technology is hugely supportive of getting a deep understanding of the area. There's some remarkable technologies that have come out in the last 5 years or so, including sort of LiDAR and other sort of ways of looking intrusively under the ground from low-flying planes and different aspects as well. So yeah, I think that something's been mentioned throughout this sort of consultation today is just the need for consultation to with stakeholders to establish whether or not these things are going to be problematic or going to be deemed as non-appropriate. So I think that's going to be fundamental looking forward, and perhaps it needs to be addressed as we move forward, is that discussion point at the earliest possible stage in the project. We'll make sure that if there is the need to do an assessment and there's a need or there's a potential to use technologies, then we need to ensure that this isn't going to have a negative effect or cause any frustrations with those on the ground. Thank you for that, Duncan.
Thanks for that, Aaron. That's helpful clarification there on that. We're also very happy, since we've still not got any further questions, if any of the participants who've already contributed, we would very much welcome additional questions. You know, these consultation sessions, we do have a limited number of them, and as Ms. Barato Tesoro pointed out, you know, there is a want to do more of these. So you know, now is a time for anybody who has a concern. You're very welcome to bring it up, even if you've already spoken. We would highly appreciate your feedback. No problem at all on that perspective. Okay, thank you, Ms. Degawan again. The floor is yours. Thanks for saving me. Over to you.
Apologies for taking the floor. I was just sort of poked to say something about technology. So yes, aside from being very careful about it, I think what is important is full information disclosure to communities on the use of, you know, technology. They have to be made aware what the technology is going to do. Often communities are excited to hear about technology. And of course, yes, it has been very useful in terms of mapping the territories and really establishing the bounds of each territory. But often it is not discussed with communities that who owns the data that this technology develops or produces. And so I think it's important, it's a very important principle that full information disclosure is done with any use of technology, even the simple use of cameras. There are stories of, it seems very useful to have these camera tracks that will track or the species, and yet the way that we position them often violates even the privacy of communities, because sometimes we place them in areas where women use it for bathing or washing clothes, and unknown to them they're being recorded. And yes, the first objective was very good. It's really to record species, but there are unintended consequences. And I believe that this has to be made known to the community so that they are more informed and they can make the best decision on the use of technology. So I just wanted to stress that very basic principle. So thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Degawan. That was very helpful feedback there, and actually some of the things that I've done camera trapping myself, and generally I've been sticking to the forest away from people, but I can imagine if you got them in the wrong place, that could be extremely upsetting to a local community to know that there was some cameras that were recording their activities. So that's a really good point, and great point on the actual thinking about the use of technology and the consultation on it. I don't know whether Aaron, do you want to come in on the use of data? Because I think this is, or maybe even Bruce, because you know about the wider policy on data, etc. Maybe Bruce first, and then Aaron, if you've got anything to add, that might make sense. So Bruce, do you have any feedback on the kind of data aspects of how we talk to people in the first place about using technology, and then also what happens with that data and who owns it after it's been collected? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Duncan, and thanks again to Ms. Minnie Degawan. Really good points, really well taken again around the use of technologies, both the opportunity and the downside risks of using it, and the need for strong community engagement around the use and the ownership of the data and how that will be disclosed. So yeah, I mean, data is always an issue, and this is something we would like to strengthen. Firstly, to say that ADB itself as an organization comes in at several levels here. We provide financing for development projects, but are not the project proponents ourselves. So we could be working with the government, or we could be working with the private sector, who would actually then be the project owners themselves. And we would be channeling financing through them. So it's important that our policy actually sets the requirements for the borrowers in terms of the use of data and the sharing of data as well. I think that's something that we need to consider. And then guidance would need to certainly be developed in some of these areas, good practice guidance, which may not be mandatory always, because it needs to fit the context and then be tailored to the specific context. So I think we do need a combination of clear policy objectives, policy requirements for our borrowers and clients, and then guidance to supplement that effectively. Now, when ADB directly finances, say for example, sometimes we support technical assistance, which can include baseline studies. When we're hiring, for example, consultants, technically ADB would own that information in terms of copyright to information that's collected. But we've been thinking about how do you make that publicly accessible, because we're an organization that wants to support sustainable development and the public good, and the information that we collect should be publicly available. This is something that we're looking at in the context of biodiversity baseline studies that we collect. How can we make that available? And I think it's very relevant in terms of cultural heritage back to the local communities to develop agreement and maybe sharing arrangements with data. When it comes to the work that's commissioned by the governments, obviously you would have government regulations, maybe freedom of information policies and other aspects that would need to be taken into consideration as well. So on the surface, I think it's something we should support and advocate for, the data sharing and the data access, although there are some complexities that I think we need to consider in terms of how sometimes it can be implemented. But your key point at the very beginning around discussing any of the use of technology and the data with the local communities and coming to some agreements on that would be very important. And that's something that maybe we can set out in terms of guidance. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Actually, Bruce, we've got a follow-up question from Grace Barreto Tesoro, which is actually on the same point, really. Well, slightly different, but about use of data for academic purposes that come from our projects. And I think this is, related and a really interesting point. I know, from a biodiversity perspective, this is often something that people really want. They want that great data that's out there. And I know that some other development agencies are looking into how this data can be shared. So if you've got any further thoughts on that, just to add additionally on your earlier point, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you very much again, Grace. So in the context of biodiversity, we're currently discussing actually between multilateral financial institutions and the wider civil society, NGO, conservation community around the processes and protocols so that we could make data from studies, say biodiversity baseline studies, available through internationally available platforms. For example, there is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. This was established a number of years ago with some grant funding from the Global Environment Facility, or they've certainly helped at some stage with the development of it. And we have a lot of data that's collected, but it either sits in PDF versions of environmental impact assessment reports, or sometimes within other background reports that consultants have produced, but may not be easily accessible by the public. So we're discussing how can you make that available so that it can then be used as a resource for academics such as yourselves or for future development projects. I think for cultural heritage, I'm not aware of similar platforms to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, but very interested to know if there are such platforms, whether supported internationally or nationally, could they be made use of? Like with biodiversity, though, we have to be careful about certain information, sensitive cultural heritage sites that you don't want to necessarily disclose their location or certain information about them. How do you protect that? And we have similar issues actually with biodiversity. For example, threatened species that could be subject to poaching, making their site location information available could put those species or those sites at risk. So there are some complexities, and we'd be very interested to receive further recommendations or submissions about how this could be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bruce. That's a helpful follow-up there. Ms. Barato Tesoro, if you've got any other further points on that, because I kind of read out your question. So if you've got any feedback there on that one, feel free to jump in now.
Thanks, Carlon. No, I'm fine with this, and I look forward to the future consultations. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Maybe I could now turn to Camilla Biag. I see your hand is raised, and then maybe we'll go to Abigail Kitma after that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Duncan. I'd just like to raise, I'm not sure if anyone raised it or is this part of the SPS in the future, is that when do we start reviewing, if there are documents in place like a management system, etc. When do we start reviewing if they're still fit for use or for purpose? Because that's one thing I think that is difficult to grasp as well for implementing agencies, that these documents, these systems, they have to be updated regularly, even impact assessments. Like any change or shift in the decision for a project or for an, during the stage of a project, you probably need to do an impact assessment again. And that's a difficult, it's a difficult news to deliver if you have to do an impact assessment again, but often it does happen. So I think that's one thing that should be stressed or placed, so it should be emphasized as well in the SPS, that when do you trigger another impact assessment, or when is your impact assessment still okay? Do you have to do it again? Or like management systems, when do you update management systems? Because sometimes the turnover for management systems is as quick as a year. And that's why there's also a new thing right now, not really new, but some conservation management systems are moving towards adaptive management, particularly for cultural landscapes. And if you're dealing with, strong linkages between cultural and natural sites, then now it's not just conservation, it's really safeguarding and stewardship that's now the thrust for this. So I'm not sure if it was emphasized in the SPS, or is it part of the future discussions for SPS?
I think, thank you very much, Grace. That was a really very good question, and I think Bruce can give you a good answer on that one. I think we've got an answer for you on that one. So maybe I'll just turn over to Bruce straight away there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's very important point. So just gives me an opportunity to maybe go through some of the documentation that we're looking at preparing and how that will link together. So firstly, we are looking at this stage of having a policy structure that would be somewhat similar to other multilateral financial institutions, such as the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IFC, where you have firstly a policy vision and commitment and policy statement for the organization. So this would be ADB's policy in terms of what are we committing to in terms of our safeguards, what's our vision for our safeguards, and what do we need to do as an organization, including our own due diligence requirements. Then we would have a series of what could be referred to as standards or requirements for borrowers and clients. And other multilateral financial institutions tend to have between 8 to 10 separate standards, starting with environmental and social assessment processes, and then moving through a range of technical standards, such as you've got cultural heritage, obviously a topic that we're discussing today. You've got biodiversity and sustainable natural resource management, pollution control and abatement, land acquisition, involuntary settlement, Indigenous peoples, stakeholder engagement, just as examples. So you would have a structure of those specific standards and requirements, setting out then the objectives, the requirements, and other specific details that the borrowers expected to deal with. Then for each one of those standards, a guidance note. So the guidance note sets out non-mandatory additional information to guide implementation. And then in addition to that, ADB, once we've got the policy in place and that is approved by ADB's board, we would then be developing further implementation information. So that would include instructions for our own staff in terms of further information around our due diligence, the management systems also. So for example, screening, categorization, the triggers for a change in project scope and when, for example, to your point around when a revised or updated environmental management plan or environmental impact assessment might be needed. Those types of details will come in the next stage when we develop our own operations manual and staff instructions. And then in addition to this, we can see also having wider implementation guidance that would be set out in terms of implementation arrangements generally to be followed by the borrowers. So there's a series of different pieces of documentation that come together. Right now, we're focusing on the policies and the standards, but we're already starting to think about the implementation arrangements. But the details of that will come in the next stage once we've got endorsement of the actual policy by our stakeholders and by the board.
Thanks for that, Bruce. Bruce, just to clarify as well, will the so if you have an existing project with an EIA that's already done, the old policy will still apply to it. Is that correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's correct. So a project that has been approved under the existing safeguard policy statement would continue to be implemented under that. However, if there is more general guidance that we would develop around certain topics that is not necessarily policy specific, that could apply to both new and existing. Remembering that good practice guidance notes are not necessarily binding documents. They're to set out how you could implement in practice. So there would certainly be some crossover to improving practice for implementation of new projects, but if it's endorsed under the existing policy, the specific requirements, the legal agreements, everything would stay in place.
Thanks. That's very helpful, Bruce. We've actually just come to the end of our time. So Camilla, if it's okay, I will move on to the last question from Abigail Kitmar, and then we will turn over to wrapping up. So Abigail, please, the floor is yours for the last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan. Mine is not really a question. I guess it's more of a reiteration of some of the points mentioned earlier. So on technology, I think, yes, it's good that we are dealing with it. And really, I think the issue is for communities to own data involving their lands, territories, and resources, including cultural heritage. So like, for example, we don't want to inadvertently publicize location of, for example, caves or sacred sites, cave burial, sacred sites, etc., or areas where there is a lot of mineral resources, which might lead to illegal mining, which many communities are dealing with. And then on the second, I guess I just like to say that I think it's good that ADB is moving into the direction where intangible cultural heritage is also having the same significance and prominence as physical cultural resources or tangible cultural heritage, because for indigenous peoples this is very important. Many projects might directly or indirectly affect their knowledge systems and practices, and many as those mentioned, other people have already mentioned earlier, it's really related to nature and the other physical cultural resources. So I hope maybe there's also I hope there could be maybe an exclusion list for projects that would really affect intangible cultural heritage that serve as identity markers for communities. This may include not only in relation to livelihood or livelihood, but also, like, for example, indigenous customary systems and justice systems. So I think that's those are also part of intangible cultural heritage, and I hope this also would be considered in the discussion for grievance redress mechanisms. So also I think it's also the point on contextualizing it to national laws and policies is important. So for example, in the Philippines, there's a movement for cultural mapping and cultural profiling. So I think that's something that's good information to start on, but that should not preclude what many have emphasized earlier, that it's still important to cross-check this and validate this with communities on the ground. So I guess those are just my points to reiterate what have been mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kidma. That's really helpful feedback there. So yeah, I mean, I think we've covered most of those points already. Perhaps if you have, Aaron, if you have any feedback on those last points, I'm conscious of time. So if you have any last point before we turn back to Azim. Aaron?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, and thanks, Abigail. Yeah, I think that your points are more of a summary of what we discussed, but also you've highlighted there that, you know, intangible cultural heritage is very diverse and needs consideration sort of to the widest possible scales. And I think, as you'll see in our summary report from our analysis of other MFIs, there was 2 MFIs there that sort of looked at the much wider reach of what should be considered intangible cultural heritage, and that's definitely going to be as part of our discussion moving forward. But I think, yeah, I think to Duncan's point, I think you summarised some of the points we've gathered already. So hopefully, unless there's any more questions there, I think that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. So this has been a really rich session. I won't say anything more. Thank you very much for your feedback. Really appreciated. So Azim, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, Duncan, and Bruce. And there were others who you didn't hear from on screen that also deserve our thanks, including Imlan, Madhumita, and of course, Jelson. But most importantly, a huge thanks to you, the participants and stakeholders who contributed, who raised the bar and really helped to inform through your insightful comments, your clear questions, your sharing of experiences, and providing constructive feedback on this cultural heritage session. We really want to thank you, and to reiterate that the comments, particularly on intangible cultural heritage that were received from this consultation and thereafter, will of course be considered in the final study report, which will inform the revision of ADB's standard on cultural heritage. Please don't go yet. We have a diverse and robust number here, 90 participants on your screen. Please give us your feedback through this Zoom poll as well as through the Mentee poll. The Mentee question is being posted on the chat box, but you will see the Zoom poll question on your screen now. Please rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how satisfied you are with today's consultation session, 5 being the most satisfied to 1 being the very least satisfied. And then for the Mentee poll that you will see in the chat box on the right, why you were either highly satisfied or dissatisfied, and what can be done to specifically improve these consultation sessions. So the ADB would like to know what specific options can be introduced to further engage stakeholders like you, to further improve the level of consultation or improve your level of satisfaction with these consultations on the Mentee poll. But for now, we are going to have an immediate reaction to how satisfied you are with today's session. Please rank this session on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most satisfied, 1 being the least satisfied. And I'm not sure how many of you have had the opportunity to respond, but if we could have that now, please. So here we go. About 69% of you have said that you are highly satisfied we've got the majority saying that they were either highly or somewhat satisfied, with only 3% saying you were somewhat dissatisfied. So as always, there's plenty of room for improvement, and the ADB would like to know how specifically improvements can occur in future consultations. You could give us that response on the mentee poll, and the mentee poll will be open until about 1 hour after. So if you haven't responded on the mentee poll, you still have an opportunity to provide that feedback for up to 1 hour after this session closes. The mentee will still be open. Thank you all for your feedback and your participation and your contribution and your sharing of experiences. And I now wish to bring you back to the Director of SDCC and the overall guide for this policy review update process, Mr. Bruce Dunn, to give us a summary of what we have heard from you and walk us through the next steps after this particular consultation. So Mr. Dunn, could you please review the discussions and allow us some insight into the next steps, please? Mr. Dunn.
Thanks very much, Azim, and thank you again so much for all of the participants for joining today, and for the participants that have shared their views today, given us recommendations, have identified issues, have made comments. It's been very thought-provoking, actually, and I have to say that I've learned a lot from this session. It's always hard to make a summary, and if you can bear with me, I will mention a number of key points that we've heard from you. However, we will be making a summary of this session, which we'll be sharing back with stakeholders. So this is just my own outline and doesn't necessarily represent all of the points that have been covered today. And as we've said earlier, the sessions will certainly be feeding into the finalization of the analytical study, which will again be made public, and then of course into the policy formulation. Now, starting with a number of points. So, firstly, recognizing that cultural heritage across the region is extremely important and also very diverse, and we do need to understand and reflect on how it is different within different countries and within different cultural settings. This includes understanding the linkages with national laws and requirements, but also I think one of the key points that we heard within this session is the need for a more people-centered approach, one that engages very closely with local communities or people that may be stakeholders or actually owners of cultural heritage, including intangible cultural heritage within their communities. We had some very good recommendations around the need for a process of engagement with local communities around cultural heritage. While expert assessment and judgments can be useful, they can't just be standalone. We need to be working with the community. So we certainly heard that message. We also heard around the relationships between culture and nature, that these are closely intertwined and that we need to look at the integration between these topics in terms of both the policy, but also how we assess and consider these issues on the ground, looking at natural heritage as part of cultural heritage. We've heard from a number of people about intangible cultural heritage, about its importance, and recommendation that should be indeed included within the new policy. However, intangible cultural heritage itself is quite diverse, and we need to understand what that means and what would be covered. And it has very specific cultural meanings that we would need to understand appropriately. Of course, intangible cultural heritage also has specific importance to Indigenous people or various different cultures and ethnic groups. So that is another important aspect to consider. Then down to some of the practical aspects, we heard some recommendations around the need for a better screening process, that rapid assessments won't give us all of the information necessary. This again links back to community engagement in the screening processes. Then in terms of the management of potential impacts on cultural heritage, we had some discussion around the need for the application of a mitigation hierarchy where avoidance is as always put forward as the starting point, the most important element in terms of how we address potential impacts. Avoiding them is always better. This also linked to a brief discussion we just touched on, the notion of exclusions. Are there certain sites where ADB financing or development activities should be excluded? And this is something that needs further consideration. Also, the wider context of both the cultural heritage, where it occurs at landscape and community levels, and how it's managed also within the context of national or local laws, regulations, cultural norms, for example, need to be considered, and cumulative impacts would also need to be considered as part of that process. And really understanding these dynamics also involves mapping, both physical but also through cultural mapping with communities. Of course, any assessment needs to consider the significance of sites, and that's something that comes from sometimes national registries, but we may not have full information. Baseline information will have often significant gaps, and that needs to be considered in terms of how further baseline information is brought together, but also consideration about the importance of the sites, the risks of the sites, the complexity and feasibility of management. We talked a little bit about technology. There were some great points that were raised there. It can be useful for assessment processes and monitoring, and there are new technologies available, and best available techniques are becoming available with the use of different technologies such as drones, ground penetrating radar. But we need to ensure that communities understand why and how these technologies would be used, ensure that their use is appropriate, understand also that there could be privacy issues, confidentiality issues that themselves would need understanding, cultural understanding of the certain sites, and protecting them sites themselves. This links to a discussion that we had around making data publicly available, but also understanding the need for some safeguards, if I can say, around how data can be made available in a safe way so that it doesn't put sites at risk or the cultural values at risk. We talked briefly about monitoring. So again, technologies can be useful for monitoring, but also communities can play a role there. Next, I'd mention we had a point raised about the need for processes to still be practical, to be efficient, and to effectively manage costs. So, there's a trade-off there around you need to improve baseline studies and baseline information and community engagement, but we also need to make it practical. So that's something that has to be considered as well. And bringing some of these issues together, we had some recommendations for guidance notes. We didn't really go into the details of here, but this is something that will need to be considered. What guidance, better guidance do we need in terms of screening, assessment, flowcharts, and the process, for example, can be extremely useful. And it's also recommended to have further information around the implementation modalities and management systems and how these would be applied. So we've covered, a quite wide range of topics today, many diverse issues, and we'll be summarizing, as I've said, these and feeding this into further consultation and engagement processes. So again, thank you extremely for your engagement today, and we look forward to your further engagement in the process. Until then, please take care, stay safe. We're still in the middle of COVID, of course, so I do wish everyone well, and please take care of your families and safety at this still difficult time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.